I'm going to be continuing with The Clue in the Crumbling Wall, and I am reading Chapter 14, Encouraging Information. I am Mrs. Delbert, the owner of the tourist home told Nancy. She led the girl into a parlor, stuffy with old-fashioned plush furniture. You are? Nancy Drew. I'm a stranger here in Hampton. Hardly a stranger by name, corrected the old lady. Frequently I've seen stories in the newspapers about your fine detective work. I never thought I'd have the pleasure of actually meeting you. Nancy flushed at the compliment. Sensing the girl's embarrassment, Mrs. Delbert said quickly, You are in a hurry, I know, so I'll tell you what I can about Floriana. She came here 10 years ago this month and rented my front room for one night. She told you her name? Not at first. She just said, Miss Johnson. The first night she was here, she was taken ill. I nursed her for 3 days. Was the illness serious? Nancy asked quickly. Oh, no. She seemed more exhausted than anything. The young woman was run down and thin as a rail. I took care of her, and at the end of the 3 days, she was strong enough to leave. Nancy asked the old lady to describe Miss Johnson. I can show you her picture, Mrs. Delbert volunteered. From a table drawer, she produced a photograph, which she placed in the girl's hand. After Miss Johnson left, I found this lying on the dresser in her room. Read what she wrote in it. In appreciation to Mrs. Delbert from Floriana. This is Floriana's picture in handwriting, Nancy said, identifying it instantly from a similar one in Mrs. Fenimore's possession. Do you know where the young woman went after she left here? Miss Johnson said she might stay a few weeks on a farm near Plainville. She didn't give you the address? No. After a pause, she added, I've always been sorry I never went later on to see her dance, but I rarely get away from here. So far as anyone knows, Floriana gave up her dancing, Nancy explained. She disappeared 10 years ago. Mrs. Delbert's eyes opened wide. How dreadful! Are you trying to find her? Oh, I hope you do. She was such a lovely person. Is Plainville far from here? Nancy inquired. I'll try that place next. About 30 miles. There's no train service from here to Plainville. And that was a funny thing, too. When Floriana left here, she directed the taxi driver to take her to the railroad station. But she couldn't have gone to Plainville by train, for there is none. Maybe she didn't realize that at the time, Nancy suggested, and later went by some other route. Thanking the old lady for her assistance, Nancy hastened to the Hampton Hotel. At luncheon, she repeated to her father what she had learned. You've done well, Nancy, he praised her. You've picked up a far better clue than I could expect you would. Then, as my reward, will you take me to Plainville? I expected that request, Mr. Drew chuckled. Yes, we'll go on if you wish. My work here is finished, so I'll have time to spare. The drive to Plainville was a pleasant one over rolling hills. Several towns lay along the way. At a number of them, Nancy inquired without success about the missing dancer. It was not until she reached the village of Hopewell that fortune favored her. At her father's suggestion, she ran into the local police station. As the girl started to tell the desk sergeant her problem, a middle-aged woman in outmoded clothes bustled in. The newcomer was Mrs. Speyer, known as the town gossip. Ignoring Nancy, she pushed her way to the desk. Sergeant, you must do something right away, she berated him in a rasping voice. Such a shiftless police force as this town has. What's wrong this time, Mrs. Speyer? The man asked wearily. 3 of my best-laying hens have been stolen. That's what's wrong. I want the thief caught and punished. Are you sure the hens weren't taken by a weasel? A weasel? Mrs. Speyer tossed her head angrily. The very idea! Farmer Hopper at the edge of town lost a dozen chickens that way, the sergeant disclosed. My advice to you is to go home and set a trap. Nancy, who at first had been annoyed by this interruption, now was secretly amused. Mrs. Speyer flounced about, insisting that her hens had been taken by a thief. When her complaint had no effect upon the sergeant, she threatened to report him to the chief of police. "Go right ahead," the police officer encouraged her. "It's your privilege." Decidedly nettled, Mrs. Speyer subsided into injured silence. She started to leave the police station, but changed her mind. Having observed Nancy at the desk, she was curious to learn what the stranger's business might be in town. Paying no attention to Mrs. Speyer, the girl told the sergeant why she had stopped at Hopewell. "I wish I could help you," he replied regretfully. "I'll make a full report of the matter, and if we discover anything, I'll notify you." "Is there no one on the force who might remember if Floriana Johnson ever came here?" Nancy asked. "Afraid not, miss. Even our chief has held office only 8 years. Mrs. Speyer edged closer. "Sergeant," she said, "I can probably help this young lady. Don't you remember that beautiful, well-dressed woman who came here about 10 years ago? The one that was hit with an automobile and taken to the hospital?" "Never heard about it," the sergeant retorted gruffly. But he did get down from the desk and go off to look up some records. "Funny thing," he said, coming back presently. "The young woman you mentioned is listed here, all right, but it says no identification. I guess if she had a bag, her name wasn't on it." "No doubt she was unconscious when she picked up," said Nancy. "But wouldn't the police have gotten her name later?" "Not if she didn't make any claim against the fellow that hit her." "And she couldn't do that," added the sergeant, "because he was a hit-and-run driver." "Maybe the hospital will know the woman's name," suggested Nancy. "I knew the nurse who took care of her," Mrs. Speyer spoke up. "Her name was Emily Foster. She told me she suspected her patient didn't give her right name to the hospital authorities when she was leaving." Here was real information which warranted investigation, Nancy decided. She asked where she could find Emily Foster. "Oh, Emily went away years ago," was the discouraging reply. "I couldn't tell you where. She promised to write me, but she never did." "Perhaps I can find out at the hospital," said Nancy. Thanking Mrs. Speyer and the sergeant for their help, the Drew girl left the police station. Accompanied by her father, she called at the local hospital. The superintendent of the institution received them courteously and, upon hearing their story, placed certain records at their disposal. No one by the name of either Flossie or Floriana Johnson had been a patient at the institution. "She may have used an assumed name," Nancy sighed. Her nurse inferred as much. "Floriana was trying to get away from her public for a while," Mr. Drew added thoughtfully. "You might talk to Joe," the superintendent suggested. "He's an old man who's been with us for 20 years, a friendly fellow, and his memory for patients is amazing." Joe was on the first floor of the hospital, scrubbing the corridor tiles. When Mr. Drew described Floriana to him, a wide grin spread over the old man's face. "Indeed, I do remember that girl. I felt powerful sorry when she went out of here in that wheelchair. She was crying her eyes out when I rolled her to the elevator." "The woman left in a wheelchair?" Mr. Drew inquired quickly. "Yes, she did. I overheard Dr. Barnes tell her she wouldn't never walk much again." "Is Dr. Barnes still with the hospital?" "No. Doc went to New York Hospital where they made him the big head man." Joe's information threw an interesting new light on the mystery. Though Nancy and her father could not be certain that the patient had been Floriana, they were inclined to think she had been. If such were the case, perhaps they had stumbled upon an explanation for her strange disappearance. Such an injury would have prevented Floriana from ever dancing again, Nancy said. That knowledge would have crushed her pride. Wouldn't it have been natural for her to take an assumed name and drop out of sight? The reason I sort of was tripping up a little as I'm reading this is because there are some uses and some words here that are offensive. Because of when this was written, there was a lot of racism, and the writers of this, some of the writing expresses racism, and I have not read it before, so as I'm reading, I'm kind of encountering certain words and things that I'm leaving out, and also I've been doing that throughout the chapter in reference to characters that they're calling crippled and things like that. So when I do get tripped up, that's probably sometimes, unless I'm just tripping up over my words, which I do, but that would be why. Okay, let me find a spot here and start again. Okay. Floriana would have done exactly that, I feel sure, Mr. Drew agreed. She never would have wanted to burden her sister or her aunt with caring for her. And if she were disabled, her foolish pride wouldn't have allowed her to marry Walter Heath, Nancy added. Oh, Dad, I feel as if we are getting somewhere on the case now. At the main desk, Nancy and her father tried without success to obtain a better identification on the woman. Emily Foster took care of her, Nancy volunteered. She could tell us something, perhaps. Do you know her address? The one I have is old, and I understand she left the place some time ago. However, the people who live there ought to be able to tell you where she is. Nancy was grateful for the address. While her father registered at a hotel, she hopefully hurried to the designated house, which stood at the edge of the town in a secluded spot. To her disappointment, she found the residence occupied by new tenants who never had heard of Emily Foster. Another blind alley, Nancy sighed as she started back to join her father. I never knew clues to be more elusive. As the girl walked along the street, she became aware of someone walking a little distance behind her. At first she thought nothing of it, but after she had covered 3 blocks, she concluded he must be following her. I don't like this, Nancy thought, quickening her pace. When she had walked 6 blocks more and he was still behind her, the girl decided to obtain a good look at the fellow. She pretended to drop her purse. Turning quickly, as if to pick it up, she gazed directly at the man. He wore a brown suit and had a sharp, angular face marked with a mole. Realizing that Nancy knew she was being followed, he wheeled and turned down a side street. He was trailing me, the girl thought. I wonder why. Nancy had never seen the man before, and she kept worrying about the matter. She intended to speak to her father about it, but found that he had invited a friend to dinner. By 10 o'clock, after a jolly evening, she had forgotten about the incident. Before retiring, father and daughter both sat down in Mr. Drew's bedroom to discuss the mystery. Nancy at once brought up the subject of Emily Foster. Don't you agree she's our best lead yet? The girl asked. Mr. Drew did not answer. In fact, for several seconds he had not been paying strict attention to what his daughter had been saying. Now so suddenly that Nancy was startled, he tiptoed to the hall door of the room. As she watched in bewilderment, he gave the knob a quick, deft twist. The door swung inward. A man in a brown suit was crouching just outside. Thrown off balance, he fell forward into the room. That's suspenseful.